I don't know if you noticed, but death was in the headlines this morning. Russian plane crash in Egypt, 224 dead. Storms and tornadoes in Texas, 6 dead. Death tolls from shootings in North Carolina and Colorado, a hotel attack in Somalia, a Halloween car crash in New York, drownings at sea in Greece. And that's just today. This year it's been more tragic shootings, flooding, wars, and real close to home for us, we know that there have been personal losses, loved ones who have died, hope and joy slipping through our fingers. It might be the case that people simply limp in to this All Saints' Day. Like with so many days, they have questions and fears that flow from their hearts. Why? Why me? Why has this happened? And pleas that pour forth from their souls, if only I'd done something different. If only help had arrived sooner. But you see, this is the state of desperation where we find Mary in our gospel story. Her brother Lazarus has died, and she is pleading and questioning and pouring out her heart and soul to Jesus, wanting to make some sense of it all, wanting to make sense of what has happened, wanting to make it bearable. Lord, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died. Death, it seems, is what hangs in the air when we gather for worship on All Saints Sunday. For today is a day to acknowledge the reality of death. To remember first, with a quite natural sense of sadness, the saints of God who have died during this last year. With them, we hold in our hearts all those who have ever been lost to death. But All Saints Sunday is also a day to remember, to proclaim, to shout from the rooftops that God has something to say about life and death. That God has acted to defeat death and keep in perfect union with Him all His saints. Tom Long, who's a professor of preaching at the Candler School of Theology in Atlanta, has said this, that at every funeral there is a powerful sermon preached, and it is either preached by the pastor or it is preached by death. That's true, isn't it? And that's true of our gospel reading as well. In the gospel story we've heard today, Jesus shows up to find that Lazarus has died. And there is a moment in the story where we are left to wonder, who will preach the sermon? Who will have the last word? Will it be death? Or will it be Jesus? But first, let me set the scene a little more fully for you, to remember what has taken place in this story. Lazarus and his sisters Mary and Martha were beloved friends of Jesus. They lived in Bethany, but Jesus was not there with them when Lazarus became ill. And so Mary and Martha, they sent word, an urgent message to Jesus that Lazarus wasn't well. But when Jesus arrived some days later, he found that Lazarus had already died. His dear friend was overtaken by death, and Mary and Martha were overcome with grief. What do we expect Jesus to do at this moment? What do we think he will say? Will he say nice things? Will he offer pleasant-sounding cliches about the meaning of life, or going to a better place, or death being no big deal? No, he doesn't come and say those sorts of things. Jesus has something far more powerful, something far more real to say instead. But look what he does first. First, Jesus goes to the place where they are grieving. He becomes greatly disturbed in spirit. He asks to go to the tomb. He weeps. You see, he enters into their grief. He comes and experiences the loss and the depth of their sorrow. What do you think that says about Jesus, about this God in the flesh? Well, it means that God has sent Jesus into the world to be a part of life and death. God doesn't deal with death from a distance, but comes in Jesus. Comes in Jesus to weep with us at the graves of those we love. Comes into the ashes of our loss, into the wreckage of all that was precious, but is now gone. How do we know this? Because Jesus wept. But here's the thing. The story doesn't end there. The story of Lazarus doesn't end with Lazarus in the tomb and Jesus weeping. Yes, Jesus has entered into this grief, but because of his love for this saint, he will not leave Lazarus bound in death. Jesus has something to say. Take away the stone. Lazarus, come out. Jesus calls him out of the grave, calls him to live, and out, released from death, alive, Lazarus comes. The story of the raising of Lazarus stands on its own as a sign and miracle of hope and love. But you see, the story also points beyond itself to something even more glorious. For the raising of Lazarus is the prelude to the story of Jesus' own resurrection. That's why the story is shared, placed here in the 11th chapter of John, to clue us into the good news that in Jesus, something is happening. In Jesus, there's healing, there's authority, there is compassion, and now, raising the dead. And if the dead won't even stay in their graves, if the dead won't even stay in their graves, then everything has changed. The story of Lazarus coming out of the tomb, we see it is but the prelude. It's the opening overture of the symphony of glory that will burst forth on Easter as Jesus is raised, conquering death and ushering in a new age where death will never, ever have the last word, because Jesus will. And you see, it's with this promise, this truth, this hope that we celebrate All Saints' Day. We celebrate all saints. We honor and we remember with hope those who've died, because Jesus has dealt with death. The dead will not stay in their graves. In Jesus, God has defeated death, so that it is not able to overcome the gift of salvation, or the connection we have with all the saints, the living and the dead. And so All Saints is not a day for simple words or tired cliches about the meanings of life and death. It's truly a day to recognize the complexities of tragedy and loss, to acknowledge that our lives, the lives of each one of us, is strewn with ash and tragedy. But but that Jesus comes into these disasters as well. Jesus comes to be with us, to weep with us, and to raise us and all God's saints to life. Amen.